Okay, this is Mr. Cannon here again, and today we're going to be looking at the Great Depression, which was a period of economic downturn. It was a catastrophe economically in America and worldwide. It started really for some Americans in the 1920s, but we generally considered the very beginning of the Great Depression for all of America to be the stock market crash in 1929. The Depression is going to last the entire decade of the 1930s, and we're only going to get out of the Great Depression with the spending that we see during World War II in 1940 and 41 as we prepared for war. So that's what we're going to be looking at today. It's an era that we don't want to repeat. It's an era that we have attempted over the decades to try to make sure that we avoid the mistakes that led to the Depression. All right, one of the first things that we need to talk about with the Great Depression is the agricultural disaster that had been happening in America for 10 years prior to the Depression, the actual Depression. The 1920s were not a period of prosperity for farmers. Mechanization, meaning that using machines to be able to grow more and harvest more crops. As you can see there, that's sort of a primitive looking combine machine there, where they're cutting, it looks like wheat. But using machines actually is going to increase the amount of crops Americans can grow. The problem with that is that we started growing too much. We produced too much. We had too many farmers being able to produce more now because of these machines. And so when that happens, you know from the rule of supply and demand, when there's an overproduction of something, that means there's less demand, and that means the price drops drastically. And so farmers were not able to make a living. Many farmers were not able to make a living. And so what they would do is they would begin to grow more crops to try to make up for the loss from the year before. And that is not the solution. That it actually hurts the situation even more. And so because the government wasn't involved at all, the government really did not look out for the needs of farmers, or workers for that matter. The government basically took a hands-off approach to the economy and allowed big business to do what it wanted to do. If anybody benefited from the hands-off approach, it was big business. But farmers certainly did not. They did not benefit from it. And in fact, farmers are going to suffer in the 1920s and then even more during the Depression. So when farm prices go down, it leads farmers to go deeper in debt. They have to take out more of a loan from the banks the next year to keep their operation going. And of course, they could not pay back this debt. And so farmers not being able to pay back their debt is going to put a strain on the banks. We're going to see banks begin to fail. It's going to happen even more after the stock market crash, but banks are already going to begin to fail, and other banks are going to decrease the amount of money available to loan to small businesses. So we can see a disaster brewing even before the stock market crash is going to happen. Okay? So agricultural disaster is certainly one reason that the Great Depression occurred. Another reason the Great Depression is going to occur is we're going to have a widening gap between the rich and the poor really emerge in the 1920s. So you can see, even though things can sometimes look good like they did in the 1920s, things that happen in one era can significantly affect the next. So what was happening in the 1920s is going to contribute in a major way to what's going to happen in the 1930s when we have this huge depression. And this widening gap is going to be between the haves and the have-nots, basically. You can see there from the two pictures, the top picture is basically the one we think of when we think of the 1920s, success and partying and just all these major changes that were happening in technology. But the truth is, the majority of Americans lived like the bottom picture. They lived in poverty. The majority of Americans, even in the 1920s, lived below the poverty line. So while it was a period of success for our economy as a whole. It was the 1920s were not a period of success for the majority of Americans. And so we're going to have business owners, big business owners, make more money and increase their wealth, but the majority of Americans are going to make less money and are going to go into poverty. And because of this, when you have all your money in the hands of a few people, if something happens to the wealthy, then it will collapse the entire economy. Now, certainly, if the wealthiest Americans today lost a bunch of money in the stock market, it would certainly affect all of us, okay? It would affect every single one of us. But the effect wouldn't be quite as great if you didn't have so much wealth in the hands of few people, if wealth was spread out a little bit more. And so in the 1920s, it wasn't spread out. You did not have a strong middle class. You had the haves, the wealthy, and the have-nots, the poor. And those two pictures sort of show that. And average Americans, even those that were near the poverty line, maybe they weren't in poverty, but they were near it, they were able to get loans through something called the installment plan. But what the bad thing about the installment plan was that many Americans began maxing out what they could get on the installment plan to buy things like refrigerators, and some Americans bought cars and things like dishwashers and electricity. Some Americans are going to get electricity even though they didn't have a lot of money. And so when Americans do that, when they max out their installment plans, then they cannot spend any more money. They've spent all they can spend. So they spent a lot of money early, but by the late 20s, the spending had stopped. It had dried up because the majority of Americans could not afford. They couldn't take out any more loans, and they couldn't afford to buy any of these products that we just talked about. They couldn't afford to buy cars. They couldn't afford to buy any more radios. They couldn't afford to buy refrigerators anymore, any brand new refrigerators. So that's going to lead to layoffs, people getting laid off from their jobs, which is going to lead to more Americans not being able to spend any money, which is going to lead to more layoffs. And it became a vicious cycle. Think of it just like a cycle where you cannot get out of it. It just keeps going and going and going. Of course, the culmination of all of this is going to be the stock market crash of 1929. So even though the stock market crash in 1929 is not the cause of the Great Depression, it is a result of these other causes, and it is going to be a cause by itself. But it is not the cause, okay? It's just something that shows us how bad the situation had gotten. And certainly the crash itself did make it even worse. Now, one of the problems with the stock market was this idea of buying stock on margin, or stock market speculation. It was a get-rich-quick scheme that led to inflated stock values. Basically, you would have these speculators who were saying the stock was more valuable than it actually was. So we're not going to get into the details about this, but just understand it like this. It was like if you had a company that was producing garbage products, but because of speculators, your company was deemed to be worth way more than it actually was. So the stock in your company was actually pretty valuable, even though eventually it's going to be found out that your company is garbage and that stock is going to plummet. And the stocks just weren't worth what the people were paying for them. Because there was no regulation of the stock market, people were allowed to buy stocks on margin, which means they're able to take out loans based on the value of the stock. So I could go to a bank and say, okay, I want to take out $1,000 in a loan, and I'm going to take that $1,000 and put it into company A. All right, because their stock is, if I take out so many shares of stock, it tells me I have to pay $1,000 to get that many shares. But as we just said before, Company A was a garbage company. And so I've taken out this loan to pay for this stock, but that stock's not worth anything in the end. In the beginning it was, but in the end we find out, hey, Company A is garbage. And so that stock price collapsed. And then when the crash happened, when everybody started selling this junk stock, Then all of a sudden you had a crash of the stock market, and people who had taken out these loans couldn't pay back what they had taken out. So if I took out that $1,000 and when I went to sell my stock, I didn't make any of it back. I lost all of it because the stock was worth nothing. By the time I sold it, the stock was worthless. Now that $1,000 that I put in the stock market is gone, and I need to pay back the bank. I was thinking I was going to take out that 1,000, and then in 10 years, 5 or 10 years, I was going to make another 5,000. So I would be able to make money, not much less not lose money. But here I've lost money and I can't pay back the banks. So those bank crashes, those bank closings that we talked about earlier are going to happen even more after the stock market crashed. There were a lot of people who were very wealthy before this crash in 1929, October 1929. There were a lot of Americans, not a lot, there were some Americans who were very wealthy, and immediately after the crash, they were in poverty. They had all of their money in stock that was worth nothing, and they lost it all. Now, does that mean that every wealthy American lost everything? Absolutely not. There were, in the Great Depression, there were still a handful of Americans that were uber wealthy. In fact, there were some Americans who made lots of money off of all of this. They actually did really well off of other people suffering, basically. But the majority of Americans, including some of those who were wealthy, lost everything in the stock market. If you had stock, you lost it. And so it's called Black Thursday for a reason. You know, October 1929, we're going to see Black Thursday where stocks plunge. They go way, way, way down. And you can see there in the headline of the newspaper, it says 11 commit suicide. There were actually people who they were wealthy, they had lost everything in the stock market, and they actually went on to the top of buildings and jumped off. There were stories of that. Now, some of that is exaggerated, but that certainly did happen. So this was a bad time. Now, as time goes on, the Depression is not going to get better. It's actually going to get worse. President Hoover, Herbert Hoover, who was the president when the stock market crashed, is going to take a lot of the blame for the Depression. Now, Hoover did not deserve all of the blame. Did Hoover deserve a little of the blame? Sure, he deserved some, but he wasn't the cause of the Great Depression. It wasn't his policies that led to the Great Depression. In fact, Hoover, even though he came into office being a more hands-off approach to the economy, he was a laissez-faire guy. Laissez-faire means hands-off approach to the economy. He did go further than other presidents in getting involved in the economy, but what he did wasn't enough. And so because it wasn't enough, he's going to get a lot of the blame for it. And in fact, those shacks that are going to people are going to live in outside of cities, you're just going to have one cardboard shack after another line up outside of these cities of America. They're going to call those little communities of shacks, they're going to call them Hoovervilles. They're going to be named for Hoover because he got so much of the blame. And people are going to be living in these shacks, some of them just, like I said, made out of cardboard because they have nowhere else to go. Now, after the crash, the reaction of the Federal Reserve, who was our sort of the chief bank that oversees all of our economy. You know, this the Federal Reserve's job basically to make sure we have enough money in the system, to make sure interest rates are correct. They're actually going to make things worse here. So the Federal Reserve didn't do a good job in 1929. They actually decreased the money supply. They believed that the problem was there was too much money in the system and that it was too hard, it was too easy to get loans. They looked at it as if, okay, all these people got all these loans that they couldn't pay back, so we need to make it harder for people to get loans. So they decreased the money supply, they made it harder for people to get loans, but that's going to shut down the economy even more. It actually was the opposite effect of what they thought. it didn't help the economy, it actually hurt it. So by making it harder to get a loan, you may have had Americans who would have gone out and tried to start a small business during this period, but now they can't get a loan, so they can't start a business, so that's jobs that are lost or jobs that are not gained. And so actually that made it worse. To make matters even worse, the government's going to pass a tariff, which was a tax on imported goods. So we put a tax on all these goods that were coming into America from other countries. And of course, when we do that, that means those countries are going to put a tax on our goods, and it hurt our international trade. And hurting international trade made things even worse. And so our reaction, our government's reaction, actually hurt instead of helped. And that's going to make the Depression, it was already going to be bad, but that just made it even worse than it was. And at some points during the Depression, we're going to see 30% unemployment, 35% unemployment. In South Carolina, there were areas in South Carolina that had 50% unemployment, meaning that in South Carolina, 1 out of every 2 people were out of work, couldn't get a job during the Great Depression at its worst. At its worst. Now, overall in America, it was the worst was around 30%. So that would be about around 1 out of every 3 Americans couldn't get work during this period. Just to give you an example, back in 2007, we had a recession that people compared to the Great Depression. I think overall unemployment maxed out at like 11%, maybe 12% during that recession. So you can see how big of a difference it was even from that recession 10 years ago and the Great Depression. 30% unemployment is way worse than 11% unemployment. So that's how bad the Great Depression was. Thankfully, we haven't experienced anything like that since this period. Another thing we've got going on during this period that's going to just hurt even worse is something called the Dust Bowl. Now, the Dust Bowl is going to be a series of dust storms out in the Midwest that's going to ruin farming. Now, the reason that we're going to see these dust storms are 2 reasons. Number one, farmers in the Midwest had not practiced scientific farming techniques. They had grown the same things in the same fields over and over and over, and you know that kills the soil. So we had this huge layer of topsoil that was nothing but loose dust, basically. It was no good at all. And if we had practiced farming techniques better during this period, we could have avoided the bad storms that we got, but we didn't. Now, the second part, and probably the more important part of these storms, was a drought. We had a huge drought in the Midwest, a long period without rain. And so that took that dry soil and just made it even worse. I mean, when you have a long period without rain, that soil just was depleted and became dust. And so when the winds came through, when you have wind, then those winds would pick up that dust and you'd have these gigantic dust storms. Look at that in that photograph there, guys. That is terrifying to look at that. They said that it was so bad that you would have to cover your mouths even to sleep. You'd have to put a cloth over your mouth. There was dust on everything in your house. So you would just get dust everywhere. They said it was so bad that when you would before you would eat, you would set the table and you would turn your glass and your plate over so they wouldn't get dirt on them. But as soon as you turned them over to eat or drink out of it, if you put water in it or you put your food on your plate, you would see dust would fall on it. That's how much dust there was. Even 10, 20 seconds, dust would start laying on the things you were eating off of. So people would get all this dust in their lungs, and of course that caused all kinds of health issues that we weren't even fully aware of during that period. And also it's going to hurt agriculture even more. Agriculture is already struggling, and this is just going to make it even worse. Farmers are going to lose everything because of these dust storms. Now, how are we going to get out of the Great Depression? Well, we have a man that's going to say he has an answer to the problems that we saw in the Depression. And his name was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, or FDR for short. Franklin Roosevelt's going to run for president in 1932, and of course he's going to win. Hoover's out. People were done with Hoover. And he's going to come in promising to bring in a program called the New Deal. He said, I'm going to offer Americans a new deal. It was sort of a play on his fourth cousin, Teddy Roosevelt, who when he was president said he was going to offer a square deal to the American people. So Franklin Roosevelt, who worshiped Teddy Roosevelt, said, I'm going to offer a new deal to the American people. Now, what was the New Deal? The New Deal was a series of government programs designed to do what we call the 3 R's: relief, recovery, and reform. Okay? Relief, recovery, and reform. Relief means it's going to provide money and jobs temporarily for to help the economy out. So relief. People are struggling. They don't have food. They don't have shelter. They don't have jobs. So we're going to provide relief, temporary, short-term relief. Then we're going to provide recovery, and these are programs that are designed to spur the economy. So we're going to recover. And then the third kinds of programs were called reforms. Reforms means we're going to change the way we do things in America so that we won't see this happen again. All right, so we got relief, recovery, and reform. Franklin Roosevelt would then engage in what he called the fireside chats through the radio. The reason they were called that is because it was the idea that Americans were sitting by the fire listening to their radio, and Roosevelt was sitting by the fire just talking like family would talk, like friends would talk if they were sitting next to each other. Roosevelt was not sitting next to them, though. He was obviously in a studio recording these things. And so through the radio, he would chat with the American people. This is really the first president to use mass communication effectively, where he's going to have the American people listening to his every word. What these fireside chats were designed to do was to bring confidence back to the economy. He was trying to reassure Americans it's going to be okay. We've got programs in place. We're going to be fine. Sort of like a parent would do with a child when you have a storm coming up. The parent would sit down and say, it's going to be okay. I'm right here. I'm gonna protect you. And that's sort of what Roosevelt was doing, trying to bring confidence back to the economy through these chats. Let's talk about some of the New Deal programs. Now, before we get into the specifics, let's make it very clear. The New Deal did not get us out of the Great Depression. The New Deal helped, it made a difference, but it did not fix the Great Depression. The only thing that's going to get us out of the Great Depression is when we start spending lots of money to make weapons and clothes and ammunition for World War II. That spending to prepare for World War II is eventually going to get us out of the Depression. Now, back to the New Deal. What did the New Deal do that tried to help? All right, let's talk about some relief programs. Okay, bank holidays were relief programs. You would have all these banks that were closing and were shutting down. And what Roosevelt would do is he would issue these bank holidays where he would shut all the banks down for a day. And the idea was you could help everybody to calm down so that people wouldn't run to their banks and take all their money out. That was one of the things contributing to these bank closings, is you had people that would panic. They would hear of a bank that was 5 miles down the road that had closed, and so they would say, oh no, my bank's going to be next. I better go take all my money out. But when people did that, when people ran, it was called a run on the banks. When people ran to the banks to take their money out, it actually caused more bank closings. So what a bank holiday did is it temporarily closed a bank so that people couldn't go out and take their money. And then things would hopefully calm down. People would calm down and say, okay, things are going to be all right. I don't need to go take out all of my savings out of the local bank. Another relief program were things like farm subsidies. So farmers were struggling greatly. So what the government would do was subsidize farmers not to grow certain crops. So they would say, look, we will actually pay you if you don't grow an extra 100 acres of wheat this year. We've got too much wheat, so we'll actually give you money not to grow wheat. That's called subsidies. And farm subsidies are still a part of our country today. They're a way that we ensure we don't produce too much. We got to take that into account. If we produce too much, that's bad not only for the farmer, but it's not really good for our economy either. And then another example of a relief program will be something called the Social Security Act. People that were most affected by the Great Depression were people who were the elderly, who relied on their family to provide for them. They were retired. And because their families, their kids were struggling and couldn't get jobs themselves, the elderly struggled even more. And so Social Security was an old age pension that it was designed to make sure that you had money coming in when you were elderly, and people pay into that system today. But Social Security was a relief program. Some examples of recovery programs, there are tons of them, guys. I can't go over all of them, but just to give you some examples. The AAA, okay? They were all known by their acronyms, by the way. The AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the Civilian Conservation Corps, or the CCC, the Tennessee Valley Authority, or the TVA, and the Works Progress Administration, or the WPA. All of these programs are designed to create temporary jobs. Now, most of these jobs, not only are they temporary, but they're primarily for young men, okay? Young men were having the hardest time finding jobs, and if you think about it, it would make sense. If you didn't already have a job, if you're coming out of high school, you don't already have a job, and there are no jobs to get, well, then you're just out of luck. So what these programs did is the government hired young men, young Americans, to go out and do certain work. And the hope was that if people could make a little money, they would start spending more money. And if they spent money, then businesses could open back up and we would see an increase in the economy. The problem was that's not what was happening. These young men who were going and taking these jobs, they would then send either money back home for people just to be able to eat, or they would save it. A lot of Americans were scared to spend money on anything that wasn't an absolute essential, that wasn't absolutely necessary. If you've ever known anybody, and you may not because some of you are so young, but my grandparents came from the era of the Great Depression. Now, my grandparents are dead. They've been dead for a while. But I know both of my grandparents, my dad's parents, went through the Depression on a farm. And I remember my grandmother, she was such a sweet lady, but she absolutely would not spend any money on anything that wasn't necessary. So she'd spend on food, she'd spend on a little bit of clothing, but other than that, she saved every penny she could. And it's because she had gone through the Depression, and that's what they were taught to do. You better save it or else you could lose it all. And so because Americans that were taking these jobs weren't spending, it really didn't get us out of the Depression. It really did not. It helped a little bit, but it didn't get us out of it because Americans refused to spend that money. Now, just to give you an example of what these programs did, the CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps, it's actually in the name, conservation. They built state and national parks. The Tennessee Valley Authority, or the TVA, actually went in and created lakes and dammed up areas so that they could use water. They could make water go in and out of places so that they could provide electricity for rural areas. So rural areas still did not have electricity, even though suburban areas and urban areas did. Rural areas did not. So the Tennessee Valley Authority went to these rural areas, especially in the South, and provided electricity by damming up areas and using water. Think of, something like the Lake Murray Dam. For those of you who live in the Midlands, the Lake Murray Dam is able, these companies are able to use that water power to provide electricity for people. And the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, those were construction jobs. So things like building parks, building libraries, building schools, building bridges, anything like that. That's what the WPA did. And in fact, it employed 3.5 million people. So that was a lot of people that got jobs in the WPA. Again, the problem was these jobs were temporary. And then the last kind of program is a reform program. Some reform programs are like the creation of the Securities and Exchange Commission, or the SEC. Now, we're not talking about the SEC football conference or SEC basketball that South Carolina is a part of. The SEC, the Security and Exchange Commission, is actually a government organization that oversees the stock market. So the point of that was to reform the system so that we would not have these worthless stocks anymore, so that we hopefully could avoid a major crash again. Now, some would say the SEC doesn't do as good a job as it should, but certainly it's better than not having it. FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, is what that's called. The FDIC ensures that our money in the bank is safe. So I don't have to worry when we have an economic collapse. I don't have to worry, uh-oh, I'm losing all my money in the bank. I better go run down to the bank and take all my money out. No, my money is insured. So today, if I have, let's say, $10,000 in savings, I don't have to worry that if that bank closes, I'm going to lose that $10,000. No, the government insures that money. So I know that if I have $10,000 in the bank, that money's not going anywhere. I'm going to still have $10,000 in the bank, even if something bad happens. Okay. There were critics of the New Deal. There were people who said the New Deal did not go far enough. So you had conservatives who believed the New Deal was bringing socialism to the country. They thought the New Deal went way too far. So conservatives said this Roosevelt guy is trying to bring communism and socialism to America, trying to spread the wealth. That's not American. Liberals, who were on the left of Roosevelt, thought it didn't go far enough in helping the poor or regulating the economy. They wanted the New Deal to go even further. And so you had Roosevelt, who had people on both sides of him that would criticize his work. Now, luckily for him, the American people were pretty much on his side. One group not on his side, you can see there in the political cartoon, was the Supreme Court. And in fact, the Supreme Court ruled a lot of the New Deal programs unconstitutional. They said they violated the Constitution, that he did not have the authority, the government did not have the authority to do the things that they were doing. Roosevelt was devastated by this. So what he did is he responded to their rulings by trying to pack the court with more justices who would favor the New Deal. Now, here's why this is important, okay? What Roosevelt was saying is, okay, we have 9 people on the Supreme Court. I'm going to add 3 more people or 4 more people to the Supreme Court. And I'm going to make sure that the 4 people I add are people who will support my decisions, the New Deal. And so then I'll get my way. The votes will go in my favor then. The problem with that is that would basically be the president controlling the judicial branch. You would have the executive branch with the president controlling the judicial branch, and that violates separation of powers, which is an important part of our Constitution. So luckily for us, Roosevelt later backed down from this. He did not go through with this plan. This would have been really bad if he had gone through with it, because then any president could say, okay, I'm just going to, if I got 15 people on the Supreme Court and they don't vote the way I want them to, I'm just going to add 5 more members. So I'm going to get my way. And basically the president would always get his way, and that's not checks and balances. That is not separation of powers. So luckily he backed down, but that was a stain on his presidency, the fact that he tried to do that. Historians look back on the New Deal, and it's criticized for not doing enough for the rights of women and minorities. Women and minorities were not given the same equal treatment as white men were. So white men really got more of the jobs, they got the better jobs in the New Deal than women and minorities did. And because it did not go far enough, people look back, historians, and say, look, the New Deal had some really good things to it, really good things to it. But the New Deal was not perfect, and the New Deal certainly did not go far enough in helping women and minorities.